So hello everyone, here we have Jean-François Clavier, more commonly known as Jeff Clavier. He's extremely experienced as a kingmaker, rainmaker in the web tech startup world. He's over 20 years experience, operational, entrepreneurial, and VC experience. So Jeff, for the benefit of our readers, can you introduce yourself briefly?
Sure.
Despite your long experience in history.
So, well, you said the key element. So, Jeff Clavier, French born, raised, educated, did a startup in the financial services market that was successfully sort of acquired. Spent 7 years then as a CTO in the acquirer. Moved to the Valley in 2000. Did 4 years as a traditional VC, and then in 2004 saw the opportunity that next generation consumer internet startups, now called Web 2.0, had with this new sort of capital efficiency that allows companies to get off the ground for a couple $100,000 as opposed to 5 million like it used to be. And so became an angel investor in those startups in 2004. In 2007, raised one of the first micro VC funds called Softec VC2, which was a $15 million fund. And recently we announced the close of our third fund, Softec VC3, which is a $55 million fund. And out of that fund, we basically do 20 investments a year. We'll do 60 investments over the life of the fund. And we invest roughly 400K on average in those companies, 1 or 2 a month. We try and buy 5 to 10% of the company, and we then become the largest or second largest investor, helping the company for the next 12 to 18 months before they raise sort of their series. Obviously, we'll help with that as well. And the 3 categories in which we spend a lot of time in will be mobility, next generation e-commerce, and vertical SaaS.
Okay, cool. So now you flew all the way here for Demo Asia. I think
Yes.
you may have seen some of the startups already. So what do you think of Demo Asia so far, and what excites you the most about Asia?
So yes, I've flown 24 hours to come, spend 36 hours in Singapore for this conference. I think what I'm excited about is to hear all those sort of programs that the Singapore government has put in place to really try and facilitate and enable entrepreneurship, both in terms of funding, in terms of immigration policies, and so on and so forth. And so, since I had the opportunity to come and speak, to give sort of the impression to the attendees how it's done, back home, it's an opportunity for me to sit down with people and sort of learn. And so I've spent quite a bit of time with government officials, with some VCs who are angel investors. I haven't met that many startups yet because I've spent 2.5 hours answering media interviews. But this afternoon I will be on stage, and after my keynote, I will look at 6 or 12 startups in the social media space.
Okay.
I think that what's exciting about Asia is obviously it's a massive market, pretty fragmented, a bit like Europe, where mobility is really sort of taken a role which is even more important than what we see today in the US. And so I think that there's a lot to be learned from the Korean market, for example, or from China, about what is done in terms of mobile infrastructure, in terms of mobile services. And so I'm trying to sort of learn how some of those trends apply to this market, and how they could sort of influence what I'm going to be investing in the US.
Okay, so just now earlier in our previous interview, you mentioned that most of your investments are in the US. So can you give one advice to, say, Asian-based startups who are looking to expand to the US or even Europe, just globally? Any advice? What would the one advice be?
So I think that typically when you start in a country, let's say like Singapore or Malaysia or Indonesia, where the actual sort of local market is just not big enough to create a really interesting company. Unlike China or India, where 1 billion or 1.6 billion people sort of are definitely enough to build a massive startup opportunity. You basically try and figure out from the get-go what a global footprint would mean to you. So you build everything, with international language, figuring out how you can serve sort of multiple countries. And the way to sort of do that is, say, focus on 3 or 4 countries in Asia first, launch the service, scale the service, learn from that, and then start expanding, in other countries, and then figure out what a US jump might mean. To be candid, in some cases Asia itself is a huge opportunity, and you can build a super valuable startup just focusing on Asia and doing it well. And so the notion of launching globally whilst, will definitely not prevent anyone from doing so, attacking the US market is so challenging that you really want to go there when you're prepared. And you have to understand that it's just a beast in its own right, and there will be startups being funded just focusing on that market. So you really want to go once you have figured out, your market penetration, you have figured out your funding, you have figured out your business model, so that you're ready for it. I think that Spotify is actually a fascinating example of a company which has killed it in Europe and taken a lot of time. It was sort of it almost became a joke as to when Spotify would actually launch in the US, because it was so complex from a rights perspective, right? And so because it's music, because it involves a lot of discussions with the rights holders, they just had to get there when they were ready. And so for Asian startups, don't be afraid. It's feasible. I do believe fundamentally that there is a total globalization of the entrepreneurship opportunities, and we will see global leaders emerge from this part of the world. But you will have to sort of get there, at the right pace with the right approach, and that might be by sort of focusing on the pan-Asian opportunity first, and then scaling in the US. Very similar to the advice I give to European startups, by the way, where I always say, even Europe with their 300 million people, is enough to build a really sort of interesting startup if you were only doing one thing, which is focusing on Europe. But once you've learned about that very sort of challenging market because of the difference in languages and taxes and so on and so forth, you will actually have a very strong position to attack the US, which is much more sort of consistent when you think about it. But there will always be sort of a US incumbent or a bunch of US companies which are trying to, or startups which are trying to get at you in that market. So you have to get there with the right funding and the right scale.
Okay, so one last question. We'd like to get to know you as a person. If you drill it down to just, say, one sentence, what is your main philosophy in life?
My main philosophy in life? I would say the only real mistake or failure is not trying.
Okay, cool. All right. So thank you very much, Clef. See you around.